Greetings, fellow man. Servus Männer. It is Red Pill Germany again, and today I want to comment on the escalation of violence on the left in the United States, for example, and how it compares to a similar escalation of violence that we had seen in Germany beginning in the 1960s. I see a lot of historical parallels here, and I think people who live nowadays, especially young people or people who didn't follow the news back then from Germany, they can learn actually quite a lot about how this escalation on the left played out in those years back then and what followed. Now, we have seen since the election of President Donald Trump, but already during the campaign, that we are facing a completely radicalized left. We have the crazy social justice warriors. We have terrorist groups like Black Lives Matter who target policemen and women who want to kill cops, basically. And then we have the typical left-wing establishment with the green people, the environmentalists and the big government people. And the narrative is clear that all the people on the right are Nazis and fascists, and you don't discuss with those people, you shoot them. And this is exactly what the left said in the 70s in Germany, and I want to explain in this video how it came to that. So the background situation was the same situation as we have now politically in Germany. That means that a coalition of the two big parties was ruling. That means the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, a so-called black-red coalition was ruling. And the problem with that is that all these smaller parties are basically they don't have a voice. When the two biggest parties form a coalition, that means they have the absolute majority, basically. And then it seems like that parliamentary opposition doesn't really make any sense anymore, because the opposition in the parliament is so tiny and the government factions have the absolute majority. So this is maybe a little unfortunate, but it is in no way an excuse for what happened. So the left-wing protesters that were radicalized from their Frankfurt school-minded professors who filled their heads with all sorts of critical theory garbage did not feel that their voice would be represented still in parliament. So they formed the APO, the Außerparlamentarische Opposition, the extra parliamentary opposition. So they wanted to make opposition on the streets and not in the parliament. That is, of course, not very democratic, but they are left-wing. They are justified in whatever they do, of course. And they justified that by saying that all these guys are Nazis. And of course, the people in power back then were older, so they were already alive during fascism in Germany. So it was easy to label them as fascists, of course. Even after substantial denazification, there were some people who worked already for the courts or for the police or something during the time of Nazi Germany. Now, of course, these good-for-nothing scumbags protested against the Persian Shah in Berlin, in West Berlin. At one of these protests, a student, Benno Ohnesorg, a student of theology, was shot in the head by a police officer of Berlin. This officer was called Karl-Heinz Kurras, and he was something of a gun nut, and it was very clear that the student did not at all attack the policeman, but the policeman shot him in the head, actually. Pretty much execution style. Now, that is rather untypical for German police. That never happened normally, but this execution of that student at this protest against the Shah of Persia was actually the spark that ignited a wave of radicalization in this APO, this extra parliamentary opposition in Germany. And then they pretty much said, oh, these police pigs, they have guns and we don't have guns, and they shoot us, they're Nazis, they're the generation of Auschwitz, they want to kill us all. And this led then to the fact that they armed themselves and that they became militant on the left. Now, there was a debate about violence, of course, as always on the left, and they decided that it is justified to exercise violence against things, but not against people. So they actually set fire to 2 department stores in Frankfurt to protest against capitalism, of course. Now, the people responsible for these arson attacks were caught, and at the trial, the founding members of what should later become the RAF. So that's not the Royal Air Force, it's the Rote Armee Fraktion, the Red Army faction or something, which would later become the leading left-wing terror organization for many decades to come. So Andreas Baader and Gudrun Ensslin, 2 of the arsonists, as well as Ulrike Meinhof, a left-wing journalist, and Horst Mahler, the lawyer of the perpetrators, among others, would be the founding members of the RAF. Now, the 4 arsonists were sentenced, but the lawyer wanted to go into revision, so to appeal the verdict, and that meant that they were let go again until the trial would continue. Now then, they took the opportunity to just disappear and to form a terrorist organization together with their lawyer. Now, that plan failed because the authorities were informed that they actually want to do that they are planning to get guns. So Andreas Baader was actually arrested by the authorities. Now, and here is where it gets interesting. Ulrike Meinhof was a radical left-wing journalist who actually got to know them in the course of that arson trial. And she scheduled a fake interview with Andreas Baader in order to free him out of prison. And the authorities in Germany back then were actually really naive and well-meaning, and they thought, oh yeah, well, let this nice young journalist lady interview that guy. Why not, right? And they actually shot a guy and freed him in the course. So, of course, they didn't plan the shootout, and then Ulrike Meinhof spontaneously decided to go into hiding with Andreas Baader. Now, of course, just violence against things was long in the past. Now they said that policemen are just pigs and they need to be shot, and don't talk to the establishment, just shoot them all. And it is also an interesting fact that after going into hiding, the RAF went into a Palestinian camp of the Fatah, Arafat's party, to get military training. And then they also robbed a couple of banks in Germany in order to get money for what they want to do and to get guns. So they were actually in league with Muslim terrorists already back then. So you see, there is a long tradition when it comes to the unholy alliance of Islamofascists and left-wing communist radicals. Even though the Fatah, of course, was rather a socialist Arab party, but yeah, nevertheless, this was already a clear sign that Mohammedans and communists actually get along very well. So after years of terrorism, including attacks on police stations and US military installations, the heads of the first generation of the RAF could finally be arrested and were imprisoned. Now what followed is a second generation of the RAF that was communicating via the lawyers of the imprisoned first generation with the first generation actually, and they were kind of carrying out their orders. The lawyers actually, of course also terrorists I would say, ended up becoming actually ministers of Germany, secretaries, and higher people in the government, and they're still alive and well. So I don't want to really go through the entire history. Links are in the description below as always. In the end there was a lot of terrorism, and it took until 1998 actually until the RAF finally disbanded. So in the end there was 3 full decades of murder and terrorism, and high up politicians as well as the media, they were all in bed with them, they were all helping the terrorists, and they're free, and they have never been trialed until this day. And actually one of the terrorists who actually was in prison, she was given a new identity after a couple of years in prison, and she is a teacher now. So what does this say about our society if we give a terrorist convict a new identity and let her work as a teacher, as an officer of the state, basically, teaching little children? That is crazy. So do you still remember what I said earlier in the video, that it was the execution of the young student Benno Ohnesorg in Berlin in June 1967 that led to that radicalization and to that notion that these fascist pigs are out to kill us? Well, it actually turned out that Karl-Heinz Kurras was not a right-wing gun nut. He was actually a spy working for the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, the secret police of communist Eastern Germany. So he was in the service of the Soviets, of the communists, and he worked for the police in West Berlin, and he was a very important spy for Eastern Germany in West Berlin. So isn't that interesting? That the guy who sparked this radicalization, and of course the propaganda of the Soviets also exploited this execution-style murder in a very severe way, and the guy who did it was actually in the service of the communists. Yeah, that was a false flag operation, and it led to 3 decades of terrorism and lots of bloodshed, and also lots of political upheaval. I mean, even people who were peaceful, who were not full-out terrorists, they thought that the state is doing horrible things to these poor young people, right? To these poor young children, and this is a police state, blah, 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 blah. But it was all a lie. From the very beginning, it was planned, and this murder that sparked the whole affair was nothing more than a communist psyops operation in Western Germany. But even when the story came out, not one of these people admitted that they went too far, that they did something wrong. No, of course not. They said, just like Hillary Clinton, in the end, what does it even matter? Because this whole radicalization led actually to the fact that they could become ministers, that they could become members of the German parliament and members of the German government even, because of this propaganda that the German state back then was basically trying to oppress and to kill these young people. So, but towards the end, I really want to comment a little bit more on this fertile ground on which this whole affair of left-wing terrorism could grow so well. Now, just like today, our universities back then were filled with people who clearly don't belong there, and they were protesting for lower academic standards, for more cheap education, and also for a bigger welfare state. And not only do they have a lack of personal hygiene in common with today's left-wing protesters, no, they are actually also characterized by the fact that they're neither hardworking nor very bright. So a lot of them ended up actually in social studies or liberal arts courses, and they never worked a day in their lives, never did any productive work in the free market, in the private sector. And when you look at our politicians nowadays, and also back then, who were in these parties like the Green Party, the Communist Party, or the Social Democrat Party, you will find a common theme. You will find that they all came directly from the university to the party, and they always worked in the public field or for some NGO, and they never did a hard day's work. And they always talked about the working class, the proletarians. But the actual German working class hated those people. They hated their guts. And this was true back then in the 60s and 70s, and it is especially true nowadays. When you look at these social justice warrior videos or these Black Lives Matter people when they occupy classrooms or when they block streets or public transportation, and there is always some angry working class guy who just wants to get to work, who cannot afford to miss a shift at work or something, and he punches them out, or he just breaks the blockade or something. And that was already true back then. The working class always hated these lazy student protesters. They were just work-shy elements of society, the very bottom of our society, who just felt betrayed, and they just wanted to have nice things without having to work for them. It was true back then, and it is especially true nowadays. It's the very same thing. And I'm just telling you guys, they just want an excuse to really go berserk. And what was a false flag operation back then could be anything nowadays. They need this little spark, and it doesn't even matter if they're in the right, or if it's a true story, or just fake news, or just a false flag operation. It doesn't matter. They want to become aggressive, they want to become militant, because they cannot compete. They cannot compete in a productive, civilized manner. They don't want to get a productive job. They don't want to get a real education. What they want to do is they want to just read their communist pamphlets and fuck up shit. So if you're interested in that, then start with the source material that I linked down below. And I think this part of our German history exemplifies rather well the sick and twisted mind of the lazy parasite, and how he actually wants to take quote-unquote revenge on society, and how he then tries to get into a position where he can siphon off income and wealth from the working people. This worked in Germany. Very prominent, very popular, powerful politicians came out of this left-winged terrorist spectrum from the 1960s and 70s. So let this be a warning to you guys. There are similar things happening in the United States right now with people who just believe the fake news, the corporate media, and the Democratic Party propaganda. They really think that they're justified in shooting Republican congressmen, for example, that they would be justified in assassinating Donald Trump. And I see strong similarities, strong parallels. So if you're interested, if you like historical comparisons, take a look at these topics. Alright, enjoy the rest of your day, and as always, Servus, Kameraden.